Good day. This is Professor Billy Bataille, and today we will be examining the firm's production decisions. We will look at whether the firm will be making a profit or a loss. In a perfectly competitive market, we have free entry so that firms can enter the market and compete with the existing firms. We also have free exit so that the efficient firm survive and the inefficient firms exit the market. Also, products sold are homogeneous, which means that they are similar and can be compared to one another. Lastly, the firms must accept the equilibrium price. They cannot dictate the price, since they are in competition with other firms. If they would sell their goods for a higher price, then consumers would not purchase their goods. And so, since each good is sold at the same price, this means that the marginal revenue made by the firm, which is the revenue that they make from selling one additional good, is equal to the price. Also, the average revenue made by the firm will be equal to the price, since if a firm sells 10 goods at the same price, it sells a good on average for the same value as the price of that good. Do you remember the marginal cost curve? If you do not, you can view one of my videos, the one on production and cost, to refresh your memory. We will need that curve, which will add to the marginal revenue curve to complete our graph. We remember that the marginal cost curve was U-shaped, and here our marginal revenue curve is a flat curve because each good are sold at the same price. One of the important rules in the decision of the firm will be that the firm equalizes marginal cost and marginal revenue. It decides the amount that it would produce at the intersection of the marginal cost and the marginal revenue curves. Why? Well, let's imagine that a firm would sell 7 goods and that the marginal revenue would be above the marginal cost for 7 units. Then that firm would want to sell more because they're making a profit on that good that they just sold. And so they would sell 8 goods. And as the graph shows, the same thing would happen where the marginal revenue is still greater than the marginal cost. And so the firm makes a profit and wants to sell more goods. But if the firm was to sell 10 goods, we can see that the marginal cost of selling the 10th good would be greater than the marginal revenue. And so that firm would not want to produce 10 goods. And so that firm would stop at 9 goods being produced. Now, we must ask ourselves, if the firm was to sell 9 goods, would it make a profit or loss? We can see from this graph that if at a production of 9 units, the average total cost is above the average revenue, which remember is equal to the marginal revenue, then that firm would make a loss. But if the average total cost at a production of 9 goods would be lower than the average revenue, which is again equal to the marginal revenue, then that firm would make a profit. How do we know this? Again, we already have a rule telling us that the amount that the firm would produce is dictated by the intersection of the marginal cost curve and the marginal revenue curve. And then, at that level of production, which is 9, we look at the value of the average total cost, we compare it to the average revenue at that same level of production, and we determine that the firm is making a certain amount of profits per unit. Of course, since that firm is selling 9 units, we simply multiply that profit by 9 to get the profit. This is actually also how we calculated the firm's loss. They are both represented by very neat rectangles that will always be very easy to calculate. Now, if when a firm produces 9 goods, it just so happens that the average total cost is equal to the average revenue, then we will say that the firm will break even. But this is not the end of the story, because even if a firm is incurring a loss, the firm might still decide to continue to produce. Why? Well, in the long run, it would make no sense for a firm to continue to produce if the price at which it sells a good is inferior to its average total cost. And so the firm would exit in the long run. But in the short run, when the firm has to decide to temporarily shut down or not, the firm is going to have a different type of reasoning. The firm is going to understand that in the short run, it must pay the average fixed costs, the cost on its rent lease, on the mortgage on the building that it built, on the truck that it has. Because it has to pay these costs, whether it is shutting down or not, then the firm is going to look at its average variable cost, such as labor, electricity, the cost of input, and it's going to reason that if the price at which it sells a good is higher than these average variable costs, then a slight profit is made on these average variable costs, which the firm can then use to pay at least some of its fixed costs. And so, even if a firm is incurring a loss in the short run, and the price at which it sells a good is lower than the average total cost, that firm will still produce as long as the price at which it sells the good is higher than the average variable cost, so that it could at least minimize its losses, since it will have to pay the average fixed costs one way or another. And now that we understood how a firm makes a decision to produce or not to produce, we can look at the entire market. From the different points at which the firm decides to produce or not to produce, we can get the short-run market supply curve, which will then tell you, for different prices, how much firms in the market would produce. We then add the market demand for that good, and we obtain an equilibrium. We now have the individual firm market and the market for that entire good side by side on our graph. Now, let's look at how the market would react to any changes that would affect it. We now have two graphs. On the top graph, we assume that we begin with a market where profits are made. We can see that on the top left-hand side graph. Because there is a profit to be made, firms decide to enter the market, which is reflected by an increase in the supply on the top right-hand sided graph. Since firms enter the market, this causes a drop in the price. We go back to the left-hand graph. We draw that decrease in the price and we see how it affects the market. The price drops up until there is no more entry or exit in the market, as the average total cost is now equal exactly to the average revenue. If we began in a market where a loss was incurred by firms, as can be seen in the bottom left hand graph, since the average total cost is higher than the average revenue, then firms would decide to exit the market, which we see on the bottom right hand graph, by a decrease in the supply. This, of course, causes an increase in the price. And when we look at the market on the left and we try to assess the impact of that increase in price, we see that the price goes up until there is no entry and no exit, because the average total cost is equal to the average revenue. And this is how the markets would react if they were not in equilibrium to reach the equilibrium. But the markets could actually begin at their equilibrium point. Let's look at another example. Here, on the graph, we can see that there is no profit to be made, as the average total cost is equal to the average revenue. Let's assume an outside factor affects that market and the demand increases, which we see on the left side graph. The shift in the demand will cause an increase in the price. If we go back to the right hand side graph and we see that the price has increased, what we notice is that the marginal revenue, the average revenue, the price, they're now all greater than the average total cost. And so, if we go back to the left-hand side graph, we have that firms, noticing that there is a profit to be made, increase their supply to the market. This in turn decreases the price once again, and what we see on the right-hand side graph is that there is no more entry, there is no more exit, because profits are back at zero. We can do one more application of this theory. Let's imagine that there is technological progress. We can see that at the beginning there is no profit to be made. We can see that from the graph at the center. If we imagine technological progress which would decrease the cost of production, then the supply of the curve would shift to the right. The firms that are using this new technology, seeing that they can earn more profit, would want to increase their production level. This causes the price to go down. But instead of going back to the center graph as we have done previously, we now have that the market has been split into two. On the center graph, we still have the old market, the market that uses the same technology. In that market, because the prices have gone down, the firms that use that old technology are now incurring a loss since the average total cost is greater than the average revenue. But on the right-hand side graph, representing the firms that are using that new technology, we can see that although the price has gone down, the cost of production have also gone down as reflected by the average total cost. Why? Because the firms using that new technology have decreased their cost of production precisely because they use that new technology. And so, the market being split into two will cause the firms that use the old technology to make a loss and to exit the market, or to adapt and to join the firm that are now using the new technology and are represented on the right hand side graph at equilibrium. And this concludes our lecture on the firm's production and costs. Thank you. Goodbye.